Okay then, so in this session we're going to go over very briefly the Russian Civil War. So obviously the Bolsheviks seized power in the October 1917 revolution. However, they only really controlled the city of Petrograd, as St. Petersburg had been renamed, um, and they only really controlled the city of Moscow. So initially the Bolsheviks under Lenin looked really weak, um, and they very soon found themselves into civil war because those people who opposed the Bolsheviks, who obviously were the former supporters of the Tsar, many of the military people, um, many of the aristocracy, many of the peasants as well in some of the areas of various parts of Russia, and also, of course, Lenin was very clear he wanted to work with other parties. So the SRs, who originally had kind of supported the revolution, um, the Constituent Assembly, which had been created, the SR became the largest party. Lenin had them expelled, then closed down the Constituent Assembly. So the SR again transferred themselves and began to join into these dissidents or these other groups who opposed the Bolshevik revolution. So really, if you were a Bolshevik, really in that winter of 1917, your chances of success look quite slim because you only really controlled two big cities, and the rest of the country seemed pretty much against you. As well, of course, foreign powers who were scared of the Bolshevik Revolution, their talk of worldwide revolution. Again, what reaction would this revolution have amongst some of Russia's former allies and enemies? So 4 years of civil war takes place, and you don't need to know the ins and outs of who was where and who was what, but you need to know some of the reasons why the Bolsheviks won, because it does have some consequences on the way they governed afterwards. Obviously, as we know, the Bolsheviks won. That wouldn't have communist Russia, and they won for a number of reasons. There were two types of opponent they faced. There were the so-called whites, who were kind of the ex-aristocracy, ex-military, all these sorts of people. And then you had the Greens. The Greens were basically nationalist groups who basically saw their chance to escape the Russian Empire of the Tsars and perhaps bring back independence for their particular peoples. For example, the Baltic states, people like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, the Ukraine was another area. So they saw independence, perhaps not so much because they liked or disliked Bolshevism in particular, but they saw their chance for national independence and their nationality to prosper free from Russian control. It's a little bit interesting actually because most of the Bolsheviks weren't actually Russian. Stalin, who we met previously, obviously he was from Georgia. And so in some ways, the fact they were seen as Russian and wanting to introduce kind of Russian values, i.e. Bolshevik Russian values, is quite interesting in itself. Anyhow, the Bolsheviks win this war, and they win it for a number of reasons. Firstly, their opponents were not united. They were a disparate group who fought in different regions of Russia. They never really kind of got their acts together and decided to fight as a collective force. And so at one time in November 1918, Admiral Kolchak declares himself the supreme ruler. He doesn't last that much longer before he's removed. There's General Kornilov appears at various stages, and there's various other generals and majors scattered throughout Russia who've got a fairly small kind of band of men, but they never really kind of decide to unite, whereas the Bolsheviks did. Okay, under Trotsky, who was the war commissioner, he established the Red Army. He really trains up the Red Army to be an effective fighting force, and they are united. They fight in a united way. They've got one very clear, disciplined leadership. Other reasons why the Bolsheviks were successful was clearly down to Trotsky. He was very good at the military stuff, very good at organising the troops, very clear strategy. And of course, the Bolsheviks did have the industry of Russia, or most of it, in their hands, because most of the industrial areas were around St. Petersburg or Petrograd, Moscow, and down that area, and they had most of the railways under their control as well. And it's quite interesting, quite a lot of the battles which take place in the Civil War all of them are not very far from railway junctions and railway lines. which again suggests that the Bolsheviks were very good at transporting the troops along these railway lines to strategic positions to either attack the Whites or to set up defensive positions against the Whites. So for a number of different reasons, the Bolsheviks win this civil war. Now, this war takes 4 years, which in some ways does show the strength of opposition to Lenin and the Bolshevik power, that they were willing to fight this amount of stuff. And it does have some consequences on Russia, which is the bit we're interested in for the exam, isn't it? As we know from previous lessons, the Bolsheviks established war communism, so these extreme kind of economic and political methods to ensure everything went into the war effort so they would win. And we see in Russia about 10 million people died in the Russian Civil War, a lot of them through famine and hunger. Also, there were casualties from the actual fighting itself. Industry, again, we did this under war communism. It was between 10 and 20% of the pre-war levels. So industry had been decimated. It was already fundamentally weakened by the First World War. It was decimated by the Civil War. The population of the biggest cities fell by over 50%. So clearly it has some really significant economic consequences. In terms of consequences on the nationalities, the Ukraine is brought back under kind of Soviet control. And then there's a war with Poland that takes place as well. The Poles see their chance for independence following the First World War. The Poles do actually... Oh, someone at the door. Give me a moment. Okay, sorry about that. The Poles see their chance for independence. They actually invade Russia and get as far as Kiev, which is in the Ukraine. Russians push them back, but Poland is recognised as an independent nation in 1920. So it has impact on the nationalities, and of course, because some of the nationalities like the Cossacks and stuff had fought for the Whites, they're obviously perceived in not the most friendly way, shall we say, by the Bolsheviks, and so again, some of the consequences on the various nationalities over the forthcoming decades kind of arises from the Civil War. In terms of government, it has quite a big impact as well, because obviously, in terms of the structures, we've already looked at the structures and how different was the communist structures to the Tsarist structures, barring the different names. A lot of power, because they'd won the Civil War really through authority, loyalty to the party, taking orders from a very select and small group of people, very much a discipline system which the communists had, or the Bolsheviks had taken up to win this Civil War. That was then continued in their form of government. Now, you might argue, well, they never were exactly pluralistic. They were never going to share power. Look what happened to the SR before the Civil War. But it was certainly true that after the Civil War, loyalty to the party, taking orders from a select group of people, this kind of discipline that was demanded, and then a very poor light on those who opposed decisions being made, often met with quite tragic ends for those people. That was then continued into the government, and you might argue that became the style of government of the Bolsheviks after the Civil War and into Lenin, and even onwards from that as well. And you might say some of that real ferocious discipline and authority, elite decision making, was really kind of the product of the Civil War on their style of government. I think the Holland textbook called it a militaristic style of government. Again, you could overplay it. You could say it was a bit there beforehand. Lenin was not exactly known for different views and stuff, was he? But it was certainly inbuilt afterwards. And of course, many of the people who formed the government, many of Lenin's supporters, those who kind of rose up through the communist system immediately after the Civil War, had fought in the Civil War, either for the secret police or in the Red Army. And so these people, again, became the main decision makers in the kind of the post-Civil War government. So you could argue it has quite a big impact, certainly on the style of government, and the fact that power had been concentrated around Lenin, the Politburo and the Ogburo. Again, it mirrored in a little bit that kind of Tsarist system from beforehand, but again, the Civil War cements that system of government in Russia. And of course, as we know, after the death of Lenin, then Stalin kind of continues that kind of, authoritarian style of ruling. So the Civil War does have an impact on the